In this screencast, we're going to look at evidence for and of evolution. And to start that, we first need to make sure that we have a definition of evidence. Just knowing that evidence is any observable artifact, a directly observable artifact, or it can be data that can be directly observed from any experiment, but it's any artifact or data that can be directly collected or observed. So in talking about evidence, evidence is used in a couple of different ways, but in science we use it to, one, actually show that change has occurred. There is no doubt that change has occurred over time on Earth, both in the physical Earth as well as life on Earth. And two, we use evidence to actually try to help explain how change has occurred. And specifically in biology, we talk about the change that occurs within populations of life on Earth. The importance of evidence is simply to note that just like in some movie or a TV show, a courtroom drama, or a law enforcement show about lawyers or cops or detectives, that you probably understand this, and obviously in real life as well, that it isn't about the individual evidence. For example, at a crime scene. So using different bits of evidence on this screen, talking about if you're familiar with the board game or the movie Clue, but it isn't about individual pieces of evidence. It's about the collection of evidence and what data or what results and conclusions it points to. So again, in say like a murder investigation, whether it's real or whether it's fiction in a board game or in this example here with Clue, one individual piece of evidence could easily be explained away. It could easily be explained away from the overall verdict of whether or not an individual, Professor Plum here, is guilty. But the importance is the collection of evidence. In the analogy that we use in class, we talk about an automobile, a car. A car is a collection of all sorts of parts, all sorts of engine parts, drivetrain parts, you've got electrical parts, but you've got windshields, you've got tires, you've got steering wheels, you have individual engine parts. If something happens, like you get a flat tire, you don't throw away the entire car. You actually just replace that individual part. And just like evidence in a murder investigation or in science, one individual piece of evidence could be explained away, could be found to be inaccurate, but it's the collection of the entire evidence that really makes the point. So we've talked in class about what evolution is, simply change in populations over time, and it isn't something that contradicts belief systems or anything like that, but it is certainly clear in life on Earth, no matter how you explain the change, it isn't about whether change has occurred. It's obviously changed, unless we can find some deserted island where the dinosaurs still roam, for example. But we just need to explain scientifically and empirically how that change occurred and what it means to us. Remember that variation has been seen in any population as well as overpopulation, and what we really mean by that and what we're talking about is over-reproduction, that populations can indeed change over time because of the different characteristics. And we know that it's due to environmental conditions, selective pressures that exist in the environment that an organism lives in. An example of one type of scientist that studies change, in particular, a paleobiologist. And paleobiologists study perhaps the number one set of evidence that shows that there has been change, and that's the fossil record. It doesn't matter if people say, well, there's tons of holes in the fossil record. Of course there are. There are a lot of yet to be discovered fossils, and it's pretty rare that a fossil would actually even be formed. You can kind of look into that yourself. But paleobiologists are scientists that study the fossil record. So explaining a little bit about what a fossil is, there's different types of fossils. There's all sorts of different types of fossils, and we're not really going to spend a lot of time trying to determine what one type of fossil, how it is different from others, but you can read through these. They're simply preserved remains of living things. That's what any fossil is, and there can be a lot of different types. Probably the most common that people would be familiar with are the petrified remains of individuals. In other words, they die, they get buried by soil somehow, some way, maybe next to a riverbed, but over long periods of time, the groundwater actually seeps through the tissues of the organism, and all of the groundwater minerals take the place of the tissues. But you're left with basically a mold of a once living individual. Again, the thing about this it's pretty unlikely because a lot of times when things die, they get eaten by scavengers or they get eroded and they get kind of carried away. It's rare and pretty special for a fossil to actually be formed. So we've established that the fossil record, collection of fossils on the Earth, are probably the number one collection of data and resources that are used by scientists to study change over time and the history of life on Earth. So let's look at how we can attempt to age or determine the relative age of different fossils. In this example, take a look at the picture that we've got, pictures A, B, and C, and we can pretty easily rank those pictures or order them from youngest to oldest just by observing them. Maybe not 100% certain, but I'm pretty confident in my ability to put these pictures in order by looking at their facial features, etc. Well, scientists can use this as well in nature. So one of the things that we do is we look at the actual layers of the Earth's crust. Stratigraphy is the study of how the layers of the Earth are organized. And so then we take and use that to make logical conclusions about the fossils that we actually find in those layers. So there's two types of ways to date fossils, to determine their date. A couple of terms here: relative dating versus absolute dating. So on the screen before, we put the individuals into order from youngest to oldest, relative to one another, just by using whatever characteristics we could come up with. Relative dating is just comparing the fossil depths in the Earth's crust to determine age. Absolute dating, which we'll come back to a little later, is trying to put an exact age on this. So absolute dating would be like using some sort of identification, a birth certificate of the individuals on the previous screen, to try to get their exact birth date determined. But relatively, with relative dating, it's really pretty an easy comparison. You look at this little graphic on the left. These represent a couple different, 5 different layers of the Earth's crust. And simply put, it's quite logical that the lowest and the deepest level is oldest, and then it keeps getting covered up by new sedimentary layers of the Earth's crust. We'll take that a step further. Using this analogy, maybe at home next to one of your parents' lazy boys or the couch or the under the coffee table, you might have a stack of old newspapers or maybe old junk mail and magazines. But if you take a look at this stack of newspapers, logically, where do you think the older versus the newer newspapers are? And logically, you get done reading the daily paper and you put it in the pile, and then the next day you get done reading the paper and you put it in the pile, and so on, and so on, and so on. So we would quite logically think that the oldest newspapers would be at the bottom, and the newest newspapers keep getting added to the top. And so it is with a logical conclusion about the Earth's crust. We make that comparison of the analogies of the newspaper to the Earth's crust. Quite logical, without trying to absolutely date how old a particular rock might be or a fossil might be, it's very logical in sedimentary rock, where you can see clear layers, that the oldest layers are on the bottom, newest layers on the top. You probably at home even, you wouldn't take and separate, find the middle of the pile, and insert today's newspaper somewhere in there so you'd have a bunch of random dates. That isn't a logical conclusion. To try to put a number on something, use this little screen. This is an example, a model of how we know and can put pretty good dates or absolute dates on fossils. For example, an ice cube, we know that ice cube, if it's above freezing, the temperature, that an ice cube is going to melt into water. Well, we would know that it would obviously melt faster in the conditions of a sauna, and it would melt slower, or maybe not melt at all, at conditions that hover right around the freezing point. The trick is that some materials, many materials, radioactive materials that exist, we know exactly how fast they quote-unquote melt, or they change from one substance to the next. And that information is what scientists use for absolute dating. So the idea behind absolute dating is looking at the components of the materials that are in a fossil, and many of them contain elements or materials that are called radioactive. A radioactive element or a radioactive substance simply means that over time it changes from one substance to the next. Radioactive means that it actually at the atomic level breaks down, kind of like an ice cube melts into a different substance. There's lots of different types of radioactive elements, or they're called isotopes of elements. Carbon-14 is the one that we probably use the most for carbon dating in biology, but also using uranium or potassium and other things. In absolute dating, down here in this box, I want to point things out. You can look into it more. You can check out the reliability, try to understand it more. Yes, there's plenty of controversy about it. We always want to remember what is science and what is the empirical evidence of showing change over time and using absolute dating to do it. So back to absolute dating, there are certain elements that we actually know how long it takes them to break down. They're called half-lives, but we know they are a constant rate. Not like an ice cube that would melt faster in a sauna than it would outside during the winter. We know the exact, we don't find any refuting data, we know the exact rate at which these fossils or these substances break down. And lastly here, sort of out of place, I guess, in my PowerPoint and screencast, is just another avenue of studying change over time, specifically a scientist called a physical anthropologist. Anthropology studies the history of specifically human life on Earth, as well as other hominids, related primates that have been in existence on the face of the Earth. And what anthropology looks at is specifically change in humans over time. So to sum up, when we look at evidence, remember that it's a collection that is important. It's the whole collection of data and the bits of evidence that all point to logical conclusions and empirical conclusions in science. One individual piece can change. If you remember, facts as they are understood today could change over time. But scientific theories use collections of evidence from all different points of study, all different collections of data to point to logical conclusions.